Hello everyone, welcome to your next section. In this one, we are actually going to scrape a website. We are going to use a couple of packages to do a scrape. We're going to look at that Turtle Soup website I showed you earlier, and we're going to build a couple of lines of code using just a couple of packages and show you how to get that HTML source code in an object that you can then manipulate. So the scraping part is basically done. We're going to learn everything about, or at least the beginnings of how to automate a process like that, so you can turn this code into something that can scrape hundreds of websites all in a second. But we're not going to talk about in this section how to process that object once you have it. That'll be for your next section. So the scraping part is what we're going to get through today. So what you're going to learn is you're going to learn some simple scraping. We're going to introduce to you two packages. One is called requests, one is called Beautiful Soup. And then we're going to get to the point where we access a website and pull the HTML source code from it. That is what we're going to have done by the end of this class, okay? So in terms of definitions, the only thing we're going to need to know is what these two packages are. Requests is a Python package that will, Python will go to the website. It's what is used to request information from a browser. It's basically like creating a small browser that it then returns information from, okay? And Beautiful Soup is a almost like a natural language processing package, but what it's designed to do is it's got a bunch of functions that are designed to manipulate, move around, remove, and adjust HTML tags once you have the HTML source code. So once we extract the HTML source code information, we're going to use requests to do that. We're going to then pass the HTML source code into what is called a Beautiful Soup object. So that HTML source code is going to become an object called Beautiful Soup that we can then pass functions through and around. And then we're going to basically end there. So you can then learn how to process that object in the next section. Okay, so when it comes to syntax, guys, I'm going to show you the code that we're going to be working with. And then I'm going to hop into Jupyter Notebook to run through it line by line so you see what I'm talking about. Okay, so let's just do that now. Okay, so this is all the code that we need in order to extract some information from a website, guys. It's not that much, is it? And actually, there is a couple extra things in here. I could remove at least 6 or 7 lines just because that's all you would technically need to build a skeleton around this. But I wanted to include some other important stuff in here. So the first thing is we have to remember you have to. When you're in, we're going to make a Beautiful Soup. We're going to do this in a Jupyter Notebook. So when you load up your Anaconda, guys, make sure you install Beautiful Soup. Okay, and this is how we are going to initialize our library, our Beautiful Soup library. We want to call it BS for Beautiful Soup, and then from BS4 import the Beautiful Soup object, basically. Okay, and then we're also just importing the requests package. Keep in mind, guys, that this is a default package in Python, so you don't have to install anything for this one. So that's really neat. Okay, so the first thing that we do in order to crawl a website is that we need a URL. We need a web address in order to crawl. And you'll notice here that even though it's a string, it obviously should be a string, I've also wrapped it in a list. And why is that? Because what if I had a bunch of other websites? I had thousands of websites I wanted to do this with. The way you would do this is, run our process through a for loop, obviously. So that way, it goes to this website, does one process, goes to this website, does one process, and automate that so it's really quick. So this is just kind of like a proper practice thing, even though there's only one website here, and that's really what you'd want to do when you're prototyping your code to make sure it gets the information that you want, is just test on one website. You can add other websites to this list if you have that information, and it'll do the same thing. Okay? So then we're going to run a for loop. So for every link in our list, our URL list here, we're going to do this scrape command. So everything indented here is basically the process needed to scrape one website, or scrape a website and extract its HTML code, assuming it has the same general structure as that we need for this. I mean, actually, for the most part, you can do this for any website, but when we get into the scraping part of this, that's, I guess, extended to next class. That's what you are able to extract information from. But in this case, what we're seeing is how to basically make requests, go to a website, take some HTML, and then convert it into a Beautiful Soup object. So the first thing we do is we have our string here, our link. So we ask our request package to do a get command. That's simply just like go get this and go to this website and get whatever it returns to us. And we store the response as R. So we're just calling it R for now. We could write this all out as response, but that's what I'm shortening it to. So this R is a request object that has a bunch of information in it. And one of the functions that you can run with R, or a request object, is checking the status code. So this is a piece of information that you'll need to know about HTML. If you've ever gone to like a website or your internet has gone down and you've gotten like a 404 error, that's there's a bunch of different errors that HTML can throw if you request a website. And when it is a successful call, when you go to a browser, you put in your URL and it's a successful request, it was able to do the get command for you, the status code for that is 200. Everything else is error, and some kind of error, okay? So what we're doing in our next set of lines here is an if conditional statement, and we're checking to make sure that the status code, that the response that it received from that get command was a successful one. And if it's not a successful one, we have it print this here, which is the link, and we're basically just throwing up an error. So that way we could maybe later on go back to this website and check why it failed. And then we use our continue command in our for loop to have it stop right here because this failed. This next set of lines is going to process that information and turn it into a beautiful soup object. But it wasn't a successful request, so we don't want it to go down there. It'll error our code and boot us out. So we then make it go back to the URL and get another one. But what happens if it was successful? What happens if this request did work? Then it would pass this if conditional statement because it's false, it's 200. So it would then go on to this next line. And what we're doing here is we then get the requests object to output the text HTML text response, which is basically the web page, the source code. And we save that into an object called page, okay? The last thing we do is we then convert our HTML. This is basically just a big string at this point. We then convert that string into a beautiful soup object. So we use the beautiful soup function and say, function, we want you to output a beautiful soup object and use the HTML parser because this is an HTML page. Beautiful soup can augment other types of pages. So, or at least convert them into soup that it can then use, okay? So what you've done here is you've taken the source code, you've turned it into a string, and then you've taken that string, and Beautiful Soup has a bunch of packages. Because HTML is consistent in the way you see source code, it's got hundreds and hundreds of lines of codes that have organized and processed and indexed that source code to create an object that you can then do very simple functions and commands on. Okay, so at this point at soup, this is our soup object, which we can then extract and process the information that we want out of the website much easier than if we were to do it with what we know about strings and slicing on our own. Okay, guys, so let's just go into our Jupyter Notebook and play with this really quickly so you see everything that's going on. So here we are here. I'm going to comment things out and go really slowly. So we import our packages. We have our URL that's a list, so we can put other websites in there. We can go google.com, what have you, but I'm just going to remove that for now. It's not necessary. And then we have our for loop. Let's see what R looks like when it comes out. It just says response 200. If we go r.statuscode, so it's already telling us that it's a response 200, but that's not like an object type that we can use simple logic in Python with, because it's not an integer or a string type. So when we do r.statuscode, the R object that's returned returns an integer that we can then do our conditional statement on. Okay, so that's why we do that. That's why we have the r.statuscode in there. We then have our if conditional statement. So this says if r.statuscode does not equal 200, so remember this logic, if statements will only run if the condition is true. So this is saying if it's anything but 200, it needs to do this, okay? But because this is 200, this is false, All right. But if it wasn't false, it was 400, we had an error. Let's actually do that. Let's do that. And now run this. Yeah, and then it failed out. Okay? So, next thing we do is I want to show you what this page looks like. Let's print it. It ran. Just forgot to print. There we go. So you see that there. It is actually the HTML code, right? It's all that stuff we saw in the source code. Let's see the type of this. Is it a string? I'm pretty sure it's a string. It could be something else. Yeah, it is indeed a string. So this would actually be really hard to parse and to do slicing on. Like, just think of what you know about string slicing, and like it's not easy to do. So instead, we use Beautiful Soup because Beautiful Soup's already done that for us. So let's just print. We're gonna print just the soup right now, and it still looks the same, guys. But when we go type of soup, it is indeed a Beautiful Soup object. And there's a bunch of Beautiful Soup functions that we can use to make our string slicing easier, okay? Which is what we're gonna do in our next class and what you kind of see alluded to below, okay? All right, guys, with that in mind, let us close up here. What did we learn today? We learned how to determine if a site is scrapable. It needs to have, paragraph and header information, text in the HTML source code in order for us to extract. We looked at how to find that information through going through the source code and also going through requests in Beautiful Soup to extract the information from Python and then convert it into an object type that we can then use for our actual scraping. So in our next section, we're going to spend a lot of time with Beautiful Soup and getting some information out of it, learning how to do indexing and manipulation with that object type. See you then, guys.